Hello, welcome to Lab 4, which also covers Chapter 7 in our textbook. This is the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is everything highlighted here in blue. So it's your skull, your spine, and your rib cage, and your sternum, the breastbone here. The appendicular skeleton, which will be Lab 5, is your arms and your legs, and what attaches your arms and your legs, to your trunk. So we're going to go through all of these different bones, and we're going to go through all the different parts of these different bones that you need to know. So first, we're going to start with the different types of bones. We have long bones. A long bone just means that it's longer than it is wide. A short bone just means that it's wider than it is tall. We have a flat bone, like that sternum, your breastbone, because it's flat. We have an irregular bone. An irregular bone just doesn't fit into any other category, is the best way to put that. And then we have a sesamoid bone. Technically, sesamoid bones are bones that are found within a tendon. So your patella, your kneecap, that is found technically within a tendon. So these different bones are bones that are going to be found with the sesamoid bone within other bones. We do have other sesamoid bones in our fingers and our feet. They're just named sesamoid bones. The patella is the only sesamoid bone in our body that technically has a name. This is a nice chart from your textbook that kind of describes what these different names mean. Like a fissure is like a slit. A foramen is an opening or a hole. A fossa is that shallow depression. A sulcus is kind of that furrow, a line that follows a bone, like an impression within a bone. We have a meatus. There's like a tube-like opening. We've got condyles, facets. Here's ones that people mix up. Trochanter is that very large projection. Tubercle, and then tuberosity. They're all different projections that come off of a bone, and they're just different sizes. So let's start with the skull. The skull is the most intricate. That's the best way to put that. There's many different bones that make up our skull. We're going to go through all of them, and we're going to go through the different parts of some of them because some of them we need to know the names of. We have the frontal bone. The frontal bone is what makes up that forehead. That frontal bone makes up even the top part of your eye there. We have behind the frontal bone, we have two parietal bones. We have one frontal bone. We have two parietal bones. We're looking at your lab sheet. If you see a 2 in parentheses next to any of the bone names, all that's telling you is that there's 2 of those bones. So parietal, you'll see 2 in parentheses around it. That just means we have 2 parietal bones. Our nasal bones, there's 2 of those. That makes up kind of that bridge of your nose between your eyes. The bone in orange is that ethmoid bone. You can see it a little bit from in that eye, but then you can see it better in that nose. That orange in that nose is that ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone is the one in green. So you can see part of it on the outside of the skull. You can see part of it in the back of the eye. So that bone is pretty deep into that skull, is another way to put that. We have the temporal bone. It's that purple bone here on the side. We have our zygomatic bone. That is this bone in orange through here. It goes back into that eye even. We have the maxilla, also known as the maxillary bones. It's listed on your sheet as maxillary. Maxilla is singular, maxillary is plural. These are technically two separate bones. You can kind of see where these two bones came together there. In your nose, we have this bone that's called the vomer. The vomer here makes up part of that nasal septum that divides your nasal cavity into right and left sides. Also in your nose, we have this inferior nasal concha. That is this bone found through here, this nasal concha. This inferior nasal concha is its own bone. On the ethmoid bone, we have, you can see the middle nasal concha, which is this portion through here. I've got other pictures to show it to you as well. On that ethmoid bone, we also have this perpendicular plate. That is the middle part that comes down on that ethmoid bone that joins up to that vomer that makes up that rest of that nasal septum. That's that part divides your nasal cavity into right and left sides. The only movable bone on your skull is the mandible. That is your jaw. The bottom part of your jaw. That is that mandible. In your eye, we have a lacrimal bone. It's kind of hard to see. It's this purple bone right in here. That is that lacrimal bone. From this angle, it's not the best view. I've got other views, so you can see it. Same with that palatine bone. This isn't the best view to see that palatine bone. You can kind of see it a little bit. That little teeny tiny blue right there. That's that palatine bone. I would never ask it from that view because no. I was looking for something. Thank you. Okay. So on this mandible, you do need to know this mental foramen. Foramen is a opening or a hole. So this hole right here, those are the mental foramen. You need that optic canal, optic fissure, or that orbital fissure, that slit. Let's look at the skull from the side. So here we still have that mandible, that maxilla, that nasal bone. You can see the lacrimal bone much better from the side. You can see that orange from that ethmoid's bone, that sphenoid bone in green. You can see the zygomatic bone in that dark orange. Now we can see that zygomatic arch. That zygomatic arch is made up of that zygomatic bone and part of that temporal bone in purple. On that temporal bone, we have this mastoid process. This you can feel behind your ear. There's this bone that sticks down a little bit. That's that mastoid process that you should be able to feel right behind your ear. I was looking for my temporal bone on my sheet. There it is. We have that external acoustic meatus or external auditory meatus that it's listed as on your sheet. External is from the outside. When we get inside the bone, the skull, we'll be able to see the internal auditory meatus. We have this styloid process, which is this part that sticks down. You can't necessarily feel that. It's below your ear. It's not the best to feel. You can feel the mastoid process. You can't feel that styloid process. The other thing we have is this mandibular fossa. Fossa is that shallow impression. So that mandibular fossa is this part right here where this mandible comes in contact with that temporal bone. You can see that parietal bone, that big pink area. You see that occipital bone, that orange in the back of the skull. That's that occipital. Now let's look at some of these sutures. We've got different sutures. We've got the squamous suture that is found between the temporal and the parietal bone. We have this coronal suture that is found between the parietal bone and the frontal bone. It's right along that coronal plane. That's coming back to you. We have that lambdoid suture. Just making sure it was on your list. It is. The lambdoid suture that is found between the parietal bone and that occipital bone. Sutures are just where these two bones come together, and they eventually fuse together, but you can still see the sutures on the bone. Now, if we look from the top, here's a better view of that coronal suture that travels across that entire length. You can see between the two parietal bones, whoops, I still wanted that highlighter. We have that sagittal suture that follows along that sagittal plane. We have that occipital bone, and between that occipital and that parietal bone, this suture here is that lambdoidal suture. It's not labeled from this view, though. Now, if we cut the skull in half and we look inside, you can still see that parietal bone. You see that purple temporal bone. Here we see the internal auditory meatus. So this here, that's the internal. You still see that occipital bone. I'm trying to point out what you can see well from this specific view. You see that ethmoid bone in orange. On the ethmoid bone, we have this crista galli. The crista galli is the portion that sticks up on that ethmoid bone. You can see that perpendicular plate that comes down into that nasal cavity. Here we come in contact with that vomer, that bone that helps to make up the rest of that nasal septum. You can see that yellow, which is that maxilla. The blue is that palatine bone. We've mentioned that in the part of the eye. It even makes up the back portion of that hard palate. The hard part of the roof of your mouth is made up of that palatine bone. The mandible, that movable bone, that's kind of that cream kind of color at the bottom. Inside of the mandible, we have another foramen. We have the mandibular foramen. That is this hole. It's found on the inside of that mandible specifically. Sorry, I'm looking. Here we have that inferior nasal concha, that pink that you can see right through here. You can still see those nasal bones, that frontal bone, that sphenoid bone in green. Now the back. So here's a better view of that occipital bone. You see that lambdoid suture really well that's following along between that parietal and that occipital bone in orange. On the back of the occipital bone, we have this external occipital protuberance. This is the part that sticks out. It's just labeled on your sheet as occipital protuberance. It's this part that sticks out on the back of your skull. You can usually feel it. Girls who like to wear headbands, like that wrap all the way around your head, this will help hold those headbands in place. If you don't have a large external occipital protuberance, headbands don't stay on your head very well. You know who you are. I'm one of those. On the bottom of the occipital bone, we have this foramen magnum. Magnum means very large. This is where your spinal cord is going to exit the skull and travel down the vertebral column. We have occipital condyles. This is what is going to come in contact with that spine, is those occipital condyles. And here's that foramen magnum, that very large opening. Here's that external occipital protuberance. You can see part of that palatine bone in blue. So we're at the looking straight down, or looking from the very bottom now. So you see that very large foramen magnum here, the very large hole. You can also see those occipital condyles very well. These condyles that go through here. Those are what come in contact specifically with your neck. Now let's go through some holes. We have this jugular foramen. That is this hole that is made between the temporal bone and that occipital bone. We have the carotid canal. So another hole that is found directly in that temporal bone. Sorry, I was trying to see what other foramen. I have the mental foramen that's found on that mandible, the mandibular foramen. Just making sure I didn't miss any other holes somewhere. Oh, that looks like it's it. So here you can see that palatine bone that makes up the back portion of that hard palate. The yellow, that maxillary bone, makes up the front part of that hard palate. Here you can still see that zygomatic arch that's made up of that temporal bone and that zygomatic bone. That temporal bone in purple, that occipital bone in orange. Now we're cut the top off and we're looking down from the inside. Here's where you can really see that sphenoid bone. On that sphenoid bone, we've got greater wings, which are down here, and we have lesser wings that are found up at the top. We have what is known as this sella turcica. It's this little area through here. It means saddle. So it kind of looks like a saddle if you were to look at it on an actual bone. Here you can see the foramen magnum, that occipital bone. You can see that frontal bone, that ethmoid bone. On that ethmoid bone, you see that crista galli that stands up, this portion through here. On either side of that crista galli, we have this cribiform plate. This cribiform plate is this area through here that I'm kind of circling, and it's got lots of little holes. This will come back to you when we get to the very last chapter, chapter 17, special senses. So all of these little holes, are technically openings into that nasal cavity, and this is how we Our sense of smell works with this ethmoid plate in this, or this ethmoid bone in this cribriform plate. Just so you know, because it will come back to you. From this view, it is kind of hard to see that jugular foramen and that you can see it sort of. Might help if I had a highlighter. That jugular foramen between that occipital and that temporal bone. It's kind of hard to see that internal acoustic meatus from this view specifically. Here is the sphenoid bone by itself. To me, it looks like a bat. So I could have this bone all by itself in a picture and asking you to identify what bone is this. But we also see those lesser wings, those smaller ones at the top, the greater wings, the larger ones below it. You can see that optic canal, which is this opening through here. It's kind of hard to see from that view. And then we have this ethmoid bone. Here's this ethmoid bone by itself. We're looking down on it. You see this crista galli that stands up. You see this cribriform plate, which is all of these little openings, all these little holes. You see this perpendicular plate that sticks down. Now, if we look at it from the front, you see that middle nasal concha. You can see that crista galli that stands up and that perpendicular plate that goes straight down. Here it is inside of the nasal cavity and the nose and the eyes. You can kind of see how everything comes together. Here we took a nice slice, coronal slice, so you can kind of see, you see that inferior nasal concha, you see that middle nasal concha, you can see that crystal galli, that perpendicular plate coming down. You can see part of that eye, you see that vomer. Here's the mandible by itself. So on our mandible, we have the body of the mandible. We have the angle. The angle is this kind of corner through here. The ramus is this portion kind of through here. We have the condylar process. And then we have the mandibular notch, which has a coronoid process on the other side. So the condylar process is this part. The coronoid process is this part through here. Here's that mental foramen again. And then you see that mandibular foramen on the inside. And then that mental foramen. Those are all the different parts of that mandible. Here's just another view so you can kind of see that perpendicular plate of that ethmoid bone. You see those nasal bones. You see that palatine bone. You see, or that maxilla, sorry, that palatine process, that palatine bone, the hard palate that makes up part of that, connects to that palatine bone to make up that full hard palate, the hard part of the roof of your mouth. Here we see the eye. So you see that lacrimal bone, you can see that ethmoid bone, you see that maxilla coming up, making the bottom portion, while that frontal bone makes the top of the eye. That sphenoid bone kind of makes up the back. That zygomatic bone will make up kind of that outer side of that eye, that nasal bone in the middle. Here's technically all the different openings in the skull. You don't need to know all of them, but it gives you, like hypo means under, below, glossal means tongue, what all of these words mean. So if it helps you to know what these words mean to help you with understanding things, everything is here in this chart for you. Our skull has several different sinuses to it. These sinuses help to lighten the skull. They also help to kind of resonate out your voice. So in your frontal bone, we're going to have frontal sinuses. In the ethmoid bone, we're going to have ethmoidal sinuses. And that maxillary bone will have maxillary sinuses. And same with that sphenoidal bone, we'll have some sphenoidal sinuses. These are just open chambers within your skull that are helping to lighten your skull and help to resonate kind of that voice. This kind of shows how air travels throughout this nasal cavity. It'll travel through these sinuses. It helps to kind of, again, moisten air before you breathe it in. And again, it's lightening that skull. Let's look at a fetal skull. On a fetal skull, they still have the same bones, but as you can see, they're not all connected together yet like they are on an adult skull. So on a fetal skull, they have larger areas of this kind of connective tissue that are known as fontanelles. So we have the anterior fontanelle, which is found in the front, like right in the middle. We have this anterolateral fontanelle found in the front on the side. We have a posterolateral fontanelle found on the side towards the back. And then we have this posterior fontanelle found in the back. They are labeled for right where they are found. Now let's move on to the rest of the axial skeleton. This is your hyoid bone. Your hyoid bone does not attach or articulate with any other bone in the human body. All you need to know is that this is the hyoid bone. I'm not going to ask you the parts to it. You don't need to know it for this class. We went through the different vertebrae sections in Lab 1. Let's go through them again. The cervical spine is your neck. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae make up that upper to mid back. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae, that's your low back. We have 5 of those. Then we have 1 sacrum and 1 coccyx. A way to remember how many vertebrae are in each section. 7 cervical, 7 a.m. breakfast. There's 12 thoracic, lunch. There's 5 lumbar, 5 p.m. dinner. That helps you to remember how many vertebrae, 7, 12, 5, 31 total. Then great. Our spine is made up of different curves. In a fetus, we have a single curve, C curve. How do we form the curve in our neck? This is why it is such an encouraged for babies to do tummy time. Because tummy time, picking up their head, helps to form that cervical curve. That curve that happens in their low back, in that green. This is what happens. This is formed when babies start to stand. That'll help to form that lower back curve. So let's look at our spine. Our spine are made up of vertebrae, several vertebrae that come together with this intervertebral disc found between every vertebrae. Between our vertebrae, we have what are known as intervertebral. Inter means between, vertebral, between the vertebrae. We have a foramen. We have an opening here. That's that intervertebral foramen. This is where different nerves are going to come out to travel different places throughout the body. So as we can see, our spinal cord is going to travel down the middle of our vertebral column through this opening. This opening is that vertebral foramen where that spinal cord travels through. Foramen is that opening again, and it travels throughout the length of the entire spine. Some features that are found on every vertebrae. We're going to have a spinous process in the back, a transverse process along the side. That's these kind of arms that stick out. The spinous process is kind of like the tail in the back. We're going to have a vertebral body. We will have a superior articular facet and an inferior articular facet or process at the bottom of every vertebrae. So let's start with looking at our cervical vertebrae. Our first and our second cervical vertebrae have their own special names. Our cervical vertebrae are labeled with a C for cervical, and then what number they are. C1 is the first one, C2, C3, 4, 5, 6, C6, C7. So C1, its specific name is the atlas. I had somebody tell me many years ago when I was in school, and it kind of stuck on how C1 is that atlas. It holds your head up, it holds your brain, so it holds the world. Your brain is your world, how you process that world. So that's kind of where that name, that helps me remember that C1 is that atlas. And I will ask you with that specific vertebrae what its specific name is. It's not C1, but atlas. C2 is known as the axis. Why? Because C2 is the vertebrae that lets you turn your head side to side to say no. So it gives that access to turn on. And we'll talk about why. But let's look at a cervical vertebrae. So we have our first one, we have C1, that atlas, and then we have a typical cervical vertebrae. So if we're looking at C1, that atlas, the difference between the atlas and any other cervical vertebrae, there's no body. You see over here, there's a vertebral body on this cervical vertebrae here. Also, it's kind of an oval shape. This will come in handy to be able to identify the difference between cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. We have our transverse process. So kind of those little arms that stick out to the side and to the front a little bit. The difference in the cervical vertebrae is they have these transverse foramen. So they have these openings in their transverse process. Why? There's a blood vessel that travels up. The vertebral artery travels through that transverse foramen up into the skull. That's why. We have that vertebral foramen, that opening where the spinal cord is going to travel. You can see that superior articular facet on both vertebrae here. On the cervical vertebrae, their spinous process is known as a bifid spinous process because there's 2 points to it. C1 does not. C1 does not have that vertebral body. It does not have that spinous process. It does have that transverse process, and it has that superior and that inferior articular facet. Let's look at C2, this axis. What makes C2 different than the rest of my cervical vertebrae? Because we still have that spinous process, we still have that vertebral foramen, we still have that superior articular facet, we have that inferior articular facet, we have that transverse process with that transverse foramen through it. Here's the difference. we have what is known as the dens. The dens sticks up and actually comes in contact with this anterior arch here of C1. This is the part that actually allows your head to turn from side to side to say no. This is the specific part of that axis of that C2 that lets you say no. We still have our vertebral body, kind of down towards the bottom here. But this is what makes C2 different than the rest of the cervical vertebrae. Now we look at thoracic. Thoracic, we have 12 vertebrae, so we T for thoracic, and then 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 12, all the way through 12. You notice that the bodies of the vertebrae get larger as we travel down. They all have spinous processes. They all have those transverse processes out to the side. They're all going to have that vertebral body. Here's the difference. Because the ribs come in contact with the thoracic vertebrae, we are going to have costal facets. We have a transverse costal facet that's on that transverse process. You only need to know them as costal facets. So we have one on the transverse process, and then we're going to have them on the vertebral body as well. The body, the shape of a thoracic vertebrae, that body is heart-shaped. That is a difference between the thoracic and the cervical. Here's that transverse process, that spinous process, that vertebral foramen, that superior costal facet. Everything else is the same. Here you see that costal facet, see that superior articular facet, that inferior articular facet, that spinous process, transverse process, vertebral body. Everything else is the same. Now we have our lumbar vertebrae. Again, they're labeled L1, L2, L3, L4, L5. There's 5 of them. Again, they have the same parts. Spinous process, superior articular facet in here. We've got our vertebral foramen. We have our vertebral body. Here's the difference. This vertebral body is kidney bean shaped. Lumbar, our vertebral body is going to be more kidney bean shaped versus our other vertebrae. So here you see that inferior articular facet. You see that vertebral body looking from the side. You see that spinous process, the transverse process. There's no costal facets here because there's no ribs in the lumbar area. So I like this chart from your textbook because it shows the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar vertebrae. So you can see kind of that oval, that heart-shaped body, that kidney bean shaped. You can also see that the vertebral body size changes. It gets larger. That vertebral foramen starts out very large. It gets smaller as it travels because there's less nerves that need to leave that spine. Nerves travel out at every single spinal level because we just need it to travel throughout the entire length of that spine. But we lose nerves that are going out to the body as it travels down further down that spine. Sacrum. So in our sacrum is like 5 vertebrae that have been like fused together. We have these sacral foramen. These are just the openings where nerves are coming out. We have our sacral canal. This is the opening again that spinal cord travels through as it keeps going down. So it's this opening through here. And then we have our coccyx, which is just this area down at the bottom here. That's the coccyx. That's all you need to know. The sternum. The sternum is made up of 3 separate bones. That is the manubrium, which is the top portion. It's this portion here. The body, which is this part here in red. And then we have the xiphoid process. The xiphoid is down here in pink. The xiphoid process is the part where this is actually the last bone to calcify in your entire body, which happens at about 40 years old. Before that, it still remains as hyaline cartilage, just kind of for your information. Before that, it's the clavicle, which I'll probably mention in the next lecture. The clavicle, because that's part of the appendicular skeleton. That one finishes calcifying at like 25. Our rib cage. Here we can see the sternum that's attached to the ribs. So we see that manubrium, you see that body, and then you see that xiphoid process down at the bottom. Our ribs. Our ribs are numbered for what vertebrae they come off of. So the first rib comes off of that first vertebrae. That 12th rib comes off that 12th vertebrae. We have ribs that are called true ribs or vertebrosternal ribs. We have ribs that are known as vertebrochondral. Chondral, remember from tissues chapter, meant cartilage. So these are also known as false ribs. You can call them false ribs. It's not written on the sheet as false ribs, but they are. And then we have floating ribs. So let's look. Ribs 1 through 7 are known as our true ribs or vertebrosternal ribs. Why? Because they come around and they come, even number 7, you can see it comes up and it comes in contact directly with that sternum. Our false ribs are 8, 9, and 10. Why are they false ribs? Because these ribs come in contact with cartilage that comes up that attaches. The cartilage then comes in contact with more cartilage, which comes up and attaches to the sternum. And then we have our 11 and 12th ribs. 11 kind of comes way back there, but those are our, you can see that there better. Our floating ribs. They are floating because they do not come in contact with the sternum. They don't even come in contact with cartilage, which comes in contact with the sternum. They are just floating in the back. So let's look at a rib. Our rib is going to have a head, which is kind of this first part here that comes in contact with the vertebral body. They're going to have a neck. That neck is the area just past the head. Then we're going to have a tubercle. If I use the right utensil. Tubercle. Tubercle is a bump. So this is kind of this bump here. That is that tubercle. Here's another angle. You can see that tubercle much better from this angle of that rib. The tubercle is what is just past the transverse process of this vertebral body. It's helping to hold that rib in place. That is that tubercle. So here you can see a really good view of that tubercle. You see that neck, you see that head that's coming in contact with that vertebral body there. Herniated disc. Our discs are made of a more tough area on the outside and then a more liquidy type of portion on the middle. When this liquidy portion in the middle gets pushed out of that vertebral disc area, it can push onto that spinal cord. It can push onto this nerve that's coming out. That is what's known as a herniated disc. It can cause severe pain. It can cause numbness. It can cause all kinds of different sensations, tingling, just depending on where it's hitting and what it is hitting. Sometimes it can be bad enough that it can actually require surgery. Let's look at the different types of curves in the spine. These are abnormal curves. A scoliosis is a lateral curve. You can see in this picture how it goes to the side. This person has a really nice, not necessarily a nice scoliosis, but it has a nice example of one. There's a nice lateral curve out to the side in the spine. A kyphosis, this is somebody pretending to have a kyphosis. This is a really bad example. If you think of a little old lady with a hunchback, that's a much better example of a kyphosis. They have an enlarged curve in their upper back. The other one is a lordosis. Lordosis for lower or lumbar spine. She's got a really good example of a lordosis. This you will see in people, usually their last trimester of their pregnancy, because they're carrying a very big belly. People who have those big beer bellies, they're another person that you'll see that lordosis in. I included a lot of pictures in the back of this PowerPoint. I went through all of the parts that you guys need to know. Here is pictures of all of these on skulls. Not colored skulls, but it points out where everything is. I would take time to look through, circle or highlight what you guys need to know, because these are the pictures on this black background that I will use to ask questions. So it'll have something that would be highlighted like this, and then it'd be like, okay, what suture is that? Or it could have something over here highlighted and say, what bone is this? So I would take time to go through these specific pictures to look at what everything is, where it's labeled. I've had students that like screenshot this with the line still taken to it and put it into a Quizlet, or even going into Quizlet and typing in the picture and like Google Images or pictures will come up, or pictures that people have uploaded before that you can use to help identify. I have fetal skulls here, so you can see like that anterior fontanelle, that anterolateral fontanelle, that posterolateral fontanelle. See, here's a really good image of that anterior fontanelle. You can see how large it is. And then I have like all the individual bones. Here's that sphenoid bone. They're labeled up in the top corner so you know what bone you're looking at. If there's individual, like that ethmoid bone here. So all of these are laid out for you to look at, to see, like that mental foramen, all of this through here, that mandibular foramen in there, that vertebral column, here goes through these vertebrae, that atlas, here's that axis, that dens, here's a typical cervical vertebrae. So there's a thoracic. It goes through everything here. And these are real bones. So you can kind of see where these bones may have worn away out over time, but these are real bones. So it's kind of cool to see these all put together. Here goes that sternum. Here's that rib, different angles, and there's all that. So I would go through these individual pictures. I included them. I went through everything that was on your sheet. But these pictures with the black background are the ones that I'm going to use for the most part for your actual exam. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thank you for listening.